Hey everyone, this is Lee Thurban, and I'm doing a quick book review of Peter Zeihans' latest book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Civilization. Now, this was published in June of 2022. It's 481 pages, published by Harper Business. You're most likely watching this video because you've seen a lot of Peter Zeihans' videos. Maybe the single best one that he did was back in March when he spoke to the War College. It's a little over an hour. He basically, since February, March of this year, has really been popular and in demand both by talk show hosts as well as giving keynote speeches because of the timing of the Ukraine war and the release of his book. And his book is incredibly pertinent to the Russia-Ukraine war, but also so many other things. So you've watched Peter's videos. You know that he's talking about de-globalization. This book gives you an incredibly strong foundation into why he says the things that he says. It lays the foundation for truly understanding where his thought process came from, and it justifies many of the thoughts that you might not have fully pieced together by simply watching the videos. This is a consequential book. This is a massively consequential book. It is one of the more important books of the last 20 to 50 years, and it is a book that you need to get, you need to read it, you need to study it, and then you need to think about how these issues are going to impact yourself. They're going to impact governments, they're going to impact business, they're going to impact personal investments, they're going to impact whether you build a bunker in your backyard and start becoming a prepper. The consequences of the ideas that he's bringing forth are just massively important. The big idea is really pretty straightforward. Population collapse and the globe changing because the United States is no longer as interested in maintaining open shipping lanes around the entire globe are going to come together, and they're going to create a de-globalization. De-globalization is going to lead to conflicts which are going to cause deindustrialization. Deindustrialization in some cases is going to lead to the loss of civilization, and in some cases, and in many cases, that's going to result in massive global famines. So that's the importance of this book. Now, the table of contents, he starts off with really talking about the unique last 75-year period in history, which he calls the order. This is the point in time when America rose to preeminence as a military and economic power in the world. And then he talks about each of the major sort of economic sectors that global commerce relies upon: transport, finance, energy, industrial materials, manufacturing, and then last but not least, he ends up with agriculture. So in the first section about the end of an era, he starts with a historical backdrop of how it all began. And that basically is that hunter-gatherers moved to the farmers, moved to water power, wind power, steam power, fossil fuels, and industrialization. The growth of civilization is incredibly closely tied to geography and the inland waterways and the blue ocean or the open ocean waterways that a nation has aspects to. It's an incredibly interesting sort of historical review of civilization. Then he describes how the United States became the superpower that it is. Basically, we're a vast island nation. We have oceans on both sides, frozen Arctic tundra on the north and high mountain deserts on the south. We have great waterways inside the country. We have a predictable climate. We have fertile soil. And then we have lots of ports around our nation to give us blue water access. After World War II, when the United States emerged as the only economic and military superpower on the globe, a number of things happened. First of all, we gained access, because of the war, to a tremendous number of ports and strong points around the globe where we could watch over commerce, watch over the shipping lanes, and watch over our adversaries. Our only real threat was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, and as a result, the United States really didn't have an enemy, so we began to focus internally on both our own consumption and purely upon building out our commercial network globally. Now, the United States industrialized over a period of about 200 years. And when people came in from the rural lands into the cities, we had a lot more urban space than the European nations did. So there was an urban sprawl that developed along with industrialization, which means that the size of the families, while diminished relative to rural farming, was not as diminished as it is in more tightly congested European and Asian markets. So our move into the industrial centers was slower, and the impact on our population was less pronounced in terms of decline than it has been for the other industrialized nations. Now, regarding industry, essentially, British was the first nation to really industrialize. It was followed by Germany, then a lot of other countries. And each nation that industrialized watched and learned from the previous industrialization processes, and essentially each nation industrialized over an ever shorter time frame. The faster a nation industrializes, the bigger the impact on the migration of people from rural to city, where they begin to see smaller families. Along at the same point in time, we had women's rights movements, contraceptive options arise for women, and therefore the seeds of population collapse were sown. The 2020s will be the year when most nations will begin to actually see the results of depopulation or population shrinkage and collapse. Peter introduces what is really a very scary word. It's de-civilization. The worst case scenario of de-globalization is the loss of actual civilization and the reversion of a country to a pre-industrial agrarian state. Okay, the end of more is a subsection that deals with the concept that the pie has always been getting bigger. In the 2010s, the world population had been increasing, but at a slower rate. In the 2020s, it stabilized and beginning to decline. Basically, as a population is increasing, the pie is getting larger, but that's no longer the case. And so within that section, he starts discussing various economic systems and introducing new economic systems and talking about what might happen in the future. It's not just a challenge, an ideological conflict between communism and capitalism. There's socialism, there's fascism, there's authoritarianism. There's a variety of hybridized systems at play, and the next world order might contain any of those. Building models is a very messy situation, and you add to that the fact that suddenly the coronavirus pandemic landed on the scene, and it's really very difficult to model exactly what's going to happen in the future. One thing that stands out, though, as you look at this era, is that the North American hemisphere, the Western hemisphere, these are relatively well protected and insulated from the cataclysmic changes that are about to descend on the world. In America, we still have lots of unutilized land that is for expansion. We have the original baby boomer generation, which gave birth to the millennials. The millennials are just now entering childbearing age. The millennials are the next largest generation to come along after the baby boomers. And they actually hold out the hope that we're not going to be either as hit by or maybe even hit at all by population collapse. Plus the facts that we're an immigrant nation. Immigrants typically get incorporated into our culture within about 3 generations, and they become truly Americanized. We have Mexico to our southern border with lots of young people, a relatively highly educated and highly skilled, developed, quasi-developed nation. And then Mexico actually has its own Mexico south of it, which is Colombia, which represents the low end of the wage scale in the northern part of the Western Hemisphere, enabling us to have a decent disparity between low wage, high wage, and middle income earners in the labor market that we have here. Regarding transport, it's been a long road to hoe. It started with people carrying loads on their backs, and then it became wheeled carts, and then river barges, deep water ships, steam powered and diesel powered, now jets. What you can transport has a tremendous impact on and how far and how fast has a tremendous impact on how much commerce you can engage in. From an industrialization perspective, transport got industrialized. We developed steam. That led to railroads. Steam railroads led to steam ocean going ships. And then diesel came along, first ocean going ships, and then back to diesel rail. These things transformed the ability to transport goods long distances. Regional trading blocks began to abound, but there was a problem because these regional trading blocks were empire-based, and there was very little trade between empires. That brings us up to World War II. World War II was the end of the old empire-based global economic order, where you had trading blocks, and it was the beginning of the most recent period of history, which has been when prosperity has occurred. The United States basically imposed order. At the Bretton Woods Conference, we were afraid of the Soviet Union. We wanted countries to line up with us. And we had a couple of basic mandates, and they were: do not interfere with shipping and do not start wars over resources. The do not interfere with shipping basically opened up the global oceans to be the conduit of commerce, and as a result, larger boats were developed. The larger a boat and the slower it sails, the lower the cost per unit of shipped goods. Containerization occurred as a result of the revolution in the shipping world. This allowed even more efficient shipping of manufactured goods, lowered the costs to the point where regional specialization could occur. This resulted in the growth of cities and megaports, at the same time reducing the need for smaller ports. Cities were no longer constrained by their ability in terms of how big they could grow, by their ability to support themselves with local resources, because all cities had access to global resources. We had back in the 1980s an event which gave us a peek at what's going to happen in the future, and that was the Iran-Iraq War that occurred in the 80s. By about 1983, Iran and Iraq the war had gotten to the point where they were sinking each other's oil tankers. This caused insurance costs to go sky high, and shipping stopped, basically causing an energy spike throughout the Western economies, and that resulted in hyperinflation. As a result, the United States, which was supposed to maintain order, that was the deal we had entered into, Ronald Reagan sent the U.S. Navy in to the Persian Gulf, and we began to escort non-Iranian ships. American carrier groups now routinely patrol the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. In a world without American naval power enforcing shipping rights, international commerce will become much more expensive, much less voluminous, and much riskier. Now, regarding transport, there will be sort of harbors in the storm to come. Regional trading blocks will begin to reoccur. Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine will be revised and reinitiated. In Southeast Asia, the countries of Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, they'll become aligned in a trading bloc, which will also probably be very closely aligned to the United States. In the Western Mediterranean, you'll probably see Turkey and Israel develop an economic sphere. In the Central European area, you have a Germanic sphere. In Western Europe, you have the French. France, by the way, is a very agriculturally rich nation with a powerful navy. In Northern Europe, you're going to have the United Kingdom, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, which have oil-rich lands, as well as navy, Britain's navy, as well as the British Isles, which are pretty good in terms of being able to generate agricultural subsistence for their people. The Middle East will end up aligning with the European nations. Shipping in general will become smaller and faster. It'll be less efficient and more expensive, but it's going to have to be smaller and faster because the world that we're seeing coming at us will have pirates, privateers, and state-sponsored privateering and piratism. Now we move on to finance. First, Peter does a quick review of the history of finance and money. Then he talks about the adventures of capital and so forth. So regarding the history of money, barter, metals, precious metals, silver, gold, the development of fiat currencies. Then he talks about debt. Asian debt-fueled growth is massive, but is primed for collapse. The implementation of the euro created an opportunity for debt binging. Many countries did. We know of problems with Greece and Italy that occurred. And American debt is looked at, which is still relatively modest by global standards. Disaster is relative, basically talking about the fiat age in which countries found that when they had fiat currencies, they could actually begin sort of just printing money to paper over their problems. The problem is everybody's doing it. The only difference is that some are printing money faster than others. Every country has a boomer group, and every country's boomer group is retiring in the 20s and 30s, and the majority of the boomers will actually enter retirement starting in the 20s, the rest of them in the 30s. This has ramifications to the global financial system because the boomers have the money, and they're going to want their money to be much more conservatively placed. Now, there's another aspect of boomer retirement which is important to countries, which is they're no longer earning money. They're no longer paying the kinds of taxes that they used to pay, which means governments aren't going to have as much money to spend as they used to have. Credit is also important. Credit markets are going to become more conservative. Most developing economies have high debt leverage. Most developing economies will have a debt reckoning at about the same time that their tax revenues will begin to decline. China is the most highly leveraged global economy by a huge margin. China's population collapse will be the most dramatic in the developing world. There will be financing in the future, but generally speaking, de-globalization will shrink the whole global market, the financial markets as well, and will shatter what remains into segregated markets. Global aging is collapsing the skilled labor pool, and financial shrinkage will make obtaining capital ever more expensive. Now we move on to energy. The first thing is candles to whale oil to kerosene to rock oil, that's what we call oil, and then to electricity. Basically, we track the progress of lighting inside of houses as well as inside of factories increases our productivity. By the time we get to electricity, we're able to work 24 hours a day, so we push the night back and dramatically increased human productivity. As far as oil goes, the American-led global order's mandate is let it flow. That result basically means the United States had to get directly involved in the Middle East to make sure that everybody played nice and didn't go to war with each other. That made a lot of people unhappy with America. Managing the Persian Gulf region is what keeps the oil flowing, and it is a huge financial drain on America. America has been the only country both capable and willing to do it, and since we're no longer dependent upon Middle Eastern oil, our willingness to get involved in messy Middle Eastern affairs is rapidly reaching its termination. The map of the oil for the contemporary time basically is that there are three major oil exporting regions: the Persian Gulf, the Russian and former Soviet Union arena, and then of course North America. Persian Gulf has problems. They don't have enough technologically competent people. They import everybody, and very importantly, they don't have a navy that allows them to not only protect their own coasts, but also the sea lanes that get their product to their customers. Russia and the former Soviet Union, they're suffering declining field production. New production, new drilling is very capital intensive. Of course, we all know they're in the middle of a war. They don't have access to capital. Their economy is collapsing. They have distribution lines from their Siberian production to the west, but not so much to the east and to the south where they'd like to sell it, given the fact they're cutting off Europe. The United States and most of North America and the top part of South America has plenty of oil. We're exporters. We have plenty of natural gas. We're in a very good shape as a result of that. Oil's not just a transportation chemical. It's not just fuel. It's also used pervasively in manufacturing, which is critical to all the commercial goods, the consumer goods that are produced around the world. It is inelastic. A small marginal disruption can have a big price impact. It's disruptible. There are choke points. It's inseparable. The whole world is tied together. There are no backups. There basically are not very many places that can export oil. Refineries are tied to the region that they get their oil from. They can't simply be retooled overnight. And then, of course, you have climate change. Bottom line is it's not economically justifiable to engage in green technologies for 90-95% of the world. The future of energy basically will continue to be fossil fuels with some reliance on green technology where it's economically justifiable. Then there's a brief discussion of industrial materials. First, we look at the history of metals. We look at the important metals, iron ore, aluminum, copper. We look at cobalt, lithium, and silver, which are critical to the modern electronic vehicle age. We look at the metals of gold, lead, and molybdenum, which are plentiful but are required for almost everything that we do. We look at the platinum group and the rare earth group of metals, and those are essential to green tech. And then we look at the reliable metals, nickel, silicon, uranium, and zinc. We look specifically at where these are sourced and where they're needed, where they're used, how they're used, and the transport linkages to get the metals from metal ore producers to the nations that refine them, to the nations that use the refined metal to create parts and subparts and so forth. So this brings us to how the world ends. And it's really very simple. De-globalization leads to a lack of trading essential materials, essentially the metals along with food products, but the essential metals that keep industry going. This ends up pinching the world's manufacturing abilities, which leads to de-industrialization, which leads to de-civilization, which leads to famine. That's a very uncomfortable sequence of leads to. Regarding manufacturing, we look at a history of manufacturing. We look at how the world grew a manufacturing base. We look at basically the Stone Age, the Copper Age, the Bronze, Iron, Steel, Industrial, and Digital Ages. We look at the process of industrialization and manufacturing that went from Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Korea, and so forth. And we also look at the implementation of containerization on shipping, which allows for the implementation of just-in-time inventorying, which is huge because of the amount of capital it frees up for commerce. The implementation of just-in-time inventorying is essentially tied to both containerization and the ability to reliably get products across oceans and large volume on inexpensive shipping. We look at the manufacturing map, which is East Asia, Germanocentric Europe, and North America. The map of the future, again, is Asia, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere. Regarding Asia, basically the Asians are the least sustainable of the group. They're politically, strategically, and culturally incapable of trusting each other. Without the United States providing a security overwatch, trade will likely diminish rapidly. Population collapse in China has already begun. It's going to lead to turmoil. Trade collapse with China leads to deindustrialization and most likely a move back to an agrarian economy. Regarding the future in Europe, Europe is aging. It started before Asia's. There's a small amount of consumer market internally. They need exports. Those are a long ways away in either North America or Asia. The lack of industrial commodities, think iron ores and think metal ores on the continent, and sparse agricultural resources means that Europe's going to need to both import and export. France in Western Europe will fare fairly well. They have better demographics and they're more insulated. They have a good industrial base. They have a strong naval force and they have agricultural resources. North African oil is both close to Italy and France, which is where the pairing will occur. Germanocentric trade will likely be pretty problematic because they don't have a navy and they're landlocked. Anglo-Nordic coalitions are likely to form up. There's plenty of petroleum and agro resources, and Britain has a navy. In terms of the Western Hemisphere, we're pretty well insulated from both economic and military potential turmoil. The United States has trade deals with Korea and Japan, likely to put one in place with the UK, which will bridge into the Anglo-Nordic coalition that will evolve. We have relationships with New Zealand and Australia and the Philippines, East Asian Bloc members. The United States dominates the Western Hemisphere, both north and south, making it impossible for Asian nations to play in our sandbox without our permission. The United States has Mexico. Mexico has Colombia. Colombia has a huge population with low labor costs, much lower than Mexico's. And so we have not only a relatively large population of skilled people in Mexico to help produce and consume, we also have some large populations in South America. Now, as far as the new world manufacturing goes, basically the longer the supply chains, the more likely they are to face some sort of interruption that'll be catastrophic. Mass production assembly lines will be less common. Economies of scale are necessary for automation. Those will be less likely. Innovation will likely begin to slow down. Supply chains will become shorter. Production will relocate closer to consumption wherever possible. New systems of production will begin to prioritize simplicity and security versus cost and efficiency. Workforces will become different and more educated. Not every economy will be able to participate. There's a big difference between a company having to deal with rising prices for their access to resources and an absolute lack of access. The first, rising prices, leads to hollowing out, and the second leads to outright deindustrialization. An industry analysis is done on the automotive, heavy vehicle, lumber, semiconductor, computer, electronics, aerospace, machinery, textiles, and wiring industries. So, agriculture. What's at stake? Well, what's at stake is really very simple. De-globalization means that we could lose the ability to feed as much as half of the global population. Clearly, China and much of the less developed world will suffer most. The ranks of food exporters will shrink. The volume of foods that are exported will shrink. The range of foods that will be exported will shrink. So how do you mitigate famine? Well, nations will begin to shift from a large-scale industrial agriculture to more geographically suited agriculture. They will also begin to shift from capital-intensive to labor-intensive methods of agricultural production. They'll get less amount of calories per land space. Shifting workforces from industry to agriculture will also happen. The era of plenty with global supply will diminish. People will grow more of what they can eat locally based upon the geography that they have. There will be a shifting from corn to wheat, which will impact the ability to produce meat. Meat eats corn. Corn is going to be a less grown crop. So there will be a shifting from meat to vegetable protein. This will happen. Regarding climate change is very location specific. Dry areas are likely to become drier. Wet areas are likely to become wetter. Marginal lands that had been industrially farmed and or intensely farmed because of industrial capabilities like irrigation and pumping will probably revert to wheat production and have lower caloric yield. The net result of all this is that global food production is going to diminish. At the same time that global food distribution is going to be disrupted. Now, the countries that are going to be okay producing for themselves and still exporting are the United States, Russia, France, Brazil, New Zealand, Argentina, Australia, Mexico, Turkey, and Canada. They're probably going to be able to export, and certainly their friends will be high on the list. That list of friends is Japan, Britain, most of Europe, Scandinavia, South Korea, and many Southeast Asian countries, but not all of them. If you're not on one of the two lists above, you may have a problem. Famine on a global scale is very likely to become a problem starting this decade. This is not a happy ending. In the coming decades, the United States, North America, and the Western Hemisphere nations will be relatively well insulated from the challenges of de-globalization. The bigger challenge will be how the rest of the world deals with the retrenchment that will happen. When governments can no longer feed their citizens, those citizens tend to get very upset. When governments and people become desperate, they are prone to making irrational decisions. The implications of de-globalization will impact nations, businesses, and individuals. To what extent will violence between nations become part of the geopolitical landscape? How will those conflicts affect the United States? What industries and businesses will be winners and losers? What kind of retirement portfolio adjustments are going to be needed? Should you become a prepper and build a bunker? Many big questions need answers. This book doesn't answer all of those questions. It builds a framework on which you can layer your questions and then analyze them in a productive manner. Get the book, read it, study it. It is, again, one of the most important and consequential books of the last 50 years. If you like this book review, please subscribe to my channel and click the like button. Thank you.